Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books and Lunch with Books live stream. If you have a cell phone on, would you mind turning it off this time? If you're not on our email list but would like to be, the box and the forms are over there. Just a couple of announcements. Next Tuesday at noon, again in person and online. We'll do that for as long as we can. Who knows? On August 17th, the novel is called 40 Patchtown. The author is Damien Dresick, and it is a novel about the coal fields of Western Pennsylvania. So we're coming up toward Labor History Week, and he'll tell us about his novel. And in 2 weeks, longtime Hinton, West Virginia journalist and Professor Tony Hilton will be here to discuss his novel, Enough, in which a newspaper publisher learns about small-town corruption and the abuse of power the hard way, whatever that means. So we'll find out on the 24th. Now, our guest today is Andrew Barwick. He has photographed America's changing industrial and post-industrial landscape for over 3 decades. His books include Along the Ohio, Industrial Perspective, photographs of the Gulf Coast, Cleveland, the Flats, the Mill, and the Hills, and the new Heartland, Looking for the American Dream, as well as the book he's going to tell you about today, which you can see is called Wheeling, West Virginia. He received a BA in Russian from Haverford College in 1979 and an M.F.A. in photography from Yale University in 1982. He's worked as a photojournalist, as the staff photographer for the International Center of Photography in New York City, as the assistant director of workshops for the Rencontres Internationales de la Photographie in Arles, France. I tried my best. And as the director of the University of Akron Press. Andrew has taught photography at Parsons School of Design, the New School for Social Research, Germantown Academy, and Oberlin College. From 1984 until 2014, he taught at University of Akron. We're very happy to have him here. Here is Andrew Barwick.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here. This is the first in-person event I've done in a long, long time. I'm delighted to be back in Wheeling. When Sean asked me to do this, I looked at what other books with lunch, what it's called, lunch with books with lunch, talks had involved, and I saw that a lot of them had people who were really experts, had real inside knowledge on some particular aspect of Wheeling, of its history, whether they were talking about the story of a mine disaster or the history of a tobacco company or whatever. Well, I'm guessing that pretty much everybody in this room probably knows more about Wheeling than I actually do, since you live here. So I'm not about to tell you about your own place. What I am going to do is tell you how a guy who's not from Wheeling came to make a book about Wheeling. I'm going to give you a little bit about my background, just to put things in context. I grew up overseas, didn't live in America till I came here to go to college. Went to college and graduate school on the East Coast, and then moved to the Midwest, moved to Akron, Ohio in 1984 to take a job teaching photography there, from which I eventually retired. So I didn't really have a lot of experience of America. We never lived here. We were 9 months old when my parents were sent overseas. My father was sent overseas. And for me, it was moving, living in New York City or living in New Haven or Philadelphia was not that different than living in Europe. And moving to Akron, moving to the Midwest was a real revelation. I felt I'd entered a kind of exotic landscape that I didn't really know and had to learn. And I spent the first couple of years looking at Akron, photographing Akron, and becoming increasingly interested in a landscape that's about making things. Akron, as many of you probably know, is where all the big American tire companies used to be based. Goodyear, Firestone, B.F. Goodrich, General Tire, we're all in Akron. It was Akron, the US's tire capital, or the tire capital of the world at some point. So it's a landscape that's shaped by what happens there. And I became interested in that idea. How do people manage to make a life for themselves in these factory towns that don't really look like everyone's ideal of what middle America looks like, that are places where things are tough and people work, and how do you understand that from looking at a place? And I was always interested in the idea of looking at a place, that the idea that if you look really carefully at a place, place, or you look really carefully at photographs that someone might have made of a place, you get an understanding of how people live there, how they use that landscape, what their role is there. So I started wandering further afield from Akron, driving around first to Youngstown in Ohio, and eventually in the summer of 1986, I kind of stumbled into the Ohio River Valley, found factory towns like East Liverpool and Mingo Junction in Ohio that I started photographing. And then one day I drove across the Ohio River and ended up in Wheeling, West Virginia, and was really kind of surprised by what I found. Rising out of these green, rolling, misty hills was what looked like a city, not a town, but a city. It had tall buildings, it had dense streets, it had alleys, it had all sorts of businesses that were not the businesses one would find in a small place like, I don't know, East Liverpool, for example. This is a picture I took that day. You don't expect to see yellow cabs in small towns in the Midwest, or, I mean, technically, I guess we're in the South here, but I mean, to me, that was a surprise. Those cabs could have been transplanted from New York City. YMCAs typically are in large cities because that's where they have a population movement that houses people who live in YMCA. So I was really intrigued by this sort of what seemed to me an anomaly of this city sort of in the middle of a place where I didn't expect it. One of the resources I use when I photograph, because I'm interested in America's industrial past, are the guidebooks that were prepared during the Depression years by the Works Project Administration, the WPA. This was a jobs program that they did for writers, and they commissioned hundreds of writers to compile these books, one for each of the 48 states. There's specialized ones for individual cities as well. So they were published between 1937 and the mid to late 40s. The Guide to the Mountain State, in other words, the one for West Virginia, was published in 1941. And it might seem weird to be using a guidebook from almost a century ago, but in fact, they give me a picture of what these places were like in their heyday, when they were prosperous, when all the mills were still working. They also provide a level of detail that you're not going to find in any other guidebook. They, village by village, small town by small town, they tell you something about its history. I mean, these books are thick. They're 700-800 pages thick, so there's a lot of information. Anyway, just to sort of give you a sense of the context of how I discovered Wheeling, after I came here and looked at the guidebook when I got home, it turned out that the author of the WPA guide felt the same way that I did about Wheeling. I'm going to quote what they wrote. They said, "Wheeling, with its throngs of shoppers, its traffic-filled streets, and the variety and abundance of its cultural and recreational facilities, appears to be a larger city than its population figures indicate." So I'm not the only one who came here and thought how interesting it is that there's a city here, not a town. There were a couple of other things that I found distinctive and interesting about Wheeling. There was kind of a sense, sort of an anachronistic sense, a sense that it was caught in a time warp. This photograph was taken in 1986. I don't think most people were still dressing that way in 1986. There was just this sense that you were sort of straddling different eras. I remember going into the Army-Navy store, which I think is still there next to the Capitol Theater, and they actually had real surplus, stuff with bullet holes in it and bloodstains on it. Literally, it was shocking, but also very interesting. So there was this sense of bridging another time frame. At the same time, what was visibly obvious about Wheeling was that it was a working city. It was a place where people made things. North and south of downtown, as you all know, there were steel mills and other factories spread up and down the river. And surrounding all these industrial installations were the neighborhoods where people lived in an era where you lived next to where you worked, because you didn't have a car and you walked to work. So obviously you recognize the Block Brothers Tobacco Factory here. I just want to point out, interest to me, what was a crucial detail, that if you look at, okay, you can see it, that one of those houses has been turned into a beauty salon, a beauty shop. I've always loved the idea of a beauty shop. It's where you go to buy beauty. But just the idea that there's this sort of integrated neighborhood where you sort of have where people live and where they work and where they shop and so forth, all seen together. Details are really important to me in the kind of pictures I make. This is not simply a picture of the tobacco plant, which to me might have been, in fact, the least interesting part of it. I was interested in the bird bath, in the way that someone was stowing their lawnmower under the stairs because they don't have a shed, in those little human details that give you a more complex picture of what a place places like, what a place is about. And especially what struck me about Wheeling, and what continues to fascinate me about Wheeling, is this palpable sense of the past, the way that the past and the present and everything in between are kind of superimposed on another. I don't mean just that there's old architecture here, which most cities have, but the fact that if you look at things, you can kind of see traces from the past. So at first glance, you're looking at two houses that seem pretty different here. The house on the right, a Victorian house with all that ornate window treatment, those tall windows and so forth. The house on the left clearly must be newer somehow, as it has either plastic or aluminum siding. But in fact, if you look at it carefully, you realize they both have the same three-sided bay window. The house on the left is also a Victorian house that someone at some point had to renovate. You can't buy prefabricated tall, skinny windows like you had in the Victorian area, so they added aluminum windows, covered the original openings, covered the siding so they wouldn't have to paint it. So you have this sense of a landscape undergoing change and the evidence of a landscape evolving and undergoing change. And that, I think, is really what's fascinating to me about Wheeling. This, again, is still 1986. That's the same Citibank building that we saw in the first image in the background. But at the same time, you see where buildings used to be and are no longer there. So you have a sense that something is going on, change is happening. As you know, central to Wheeling's history has been the presence of the steel mills. Well, by the time I found the place in 1986, the mills are starting to shut down. Wheeling Pitt had already started to lay off people at some of their mills and shuttered others. And, you know, as you all know, there were a series of bankruptcies that followed. So it was a landscape that was in flux, but it also seemed to be a landscape that was in decline. And yet, paradoxically, it was also a place that seemed like, you know, a quintessential small-town American place where kids are bicycling on the street and people are spending a summer evening sitting on their porch talking. There was that sense of an idealized version of America, which of course is what I grew up with, not living here. Sort of my sense of America came from reading Dick and Jane primers and books like that, you know, with the Red Wagon and the Apple Orchard. And what I found in Wheeling is both that version of America and a kind of grittier version of what it's like to live in an industrial town. My involvement with Wheeling deepened in 1987 when I was approached by a curator who was putting together a show for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is an organization that restores architecturally significant buildings. They chose 20 buildings around the country to commemorate the bicentennial of the American Constitution, which would have been 1988. Including Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Bath Iron Works in Maine, a ghost ranch in Texas, and the Wheeling Suspension Bridge. So they asked me to photograph the Wheeling Suspension Bridge. And I spent a good part of that summer coming back and forth to Wheeling, making pictures from every vantage point imaginable, from under the bridge, from far away, from very close up. I didn't know how many pictures they were going to use. It turned out they were going to use 5 from each of the sites, but I wanted to give them as broad a variety. You know, it was almost an exercise in how many different ways can you photograph the same thing. From above the bridge. I don't remember how I got permission to do this. I know I had someone with me. I know I had a harness and a hard hat and so forth. Somebody, I don't remember the logistics, but yeah, it was pretty scary. But it allows you to see several things that I think are really kind of important. First of all, you see where the cables attach to the ground. So it tells you something really kind of significant structurally about the bridge. But it also reinforces what the WPA guide talks about. You see a bustling town. You've got, you know, pedestrians crossing the road, other people riding in the back of trucks. There's just a lot going on. It's a lively place. The exhibition opened at the National Geographic Society in Washington. It included 5 of my pictures. I went to the opening, as did members of the Wheeling branch of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. A few months later, I get a letter from the curator saying that the Wheeling National Trust people have asked that my photographs be taken out of the show. They were objected, number one, to the fact that none of the 5 pictures that the curator chose showed the whole bridge. You don't see both piers with the span in between in any of the photographs. They particularly took exception to this picture, which I think most of you probably recognize as the site of, this is the Wheeling end of the bridge. They thought that the photograph was disrespectful to the bridge, that you couldn't see its architecture, that including the tile work of the hotel on the right was, inappropriate. They thought that the juxtaposition of the no buses sign with the bus, which they were pointed out was not technically on the bridge. They thought that kind of, it's not really sarcasm, but that was not appropriate. And they objected to the fact that I included the buildings in the background on the left, because when they were restored, they did not use historically accurate colors. Bearing in mind it's a black and white picture, so you can't see the colors. Well, the curator stuck to his guns, and the upshot was that instead of traveling to 20 cities, the show traveled to 19. It did not go to Oberlin Park as it had originally been scheduled. So I was essentially banned at wheeling. Oh, well, let me go back a second. But, I just want to point out that all those things that they found problematical were what I liked about the picture, what interested me about the picture. I love the way the bridge is integrated into the city and things overlap and you have these layerings of things. And how things fit together in a picture, for me, is really critical. I'm very, very particular about how I frame things, what happens around the edges of the picture, how things overlap in space. This is actually not Wheeling, as many of you will recognize. It's the Old Stone Arch Viaduct, Old Stone Viaduct in Bel Air across the river, a little bit downstream. I'm actually in the middle of reading a biography of the great American Depression-era photographer called Russell Lee by Mary Jane Apple. And he studied at one point with a famous American early 20th century painter from the Ashcan School, a guy called John Sloan. And in the book, the author quotes something that John Sloan used to tell his students, which when I read that a few days ago, I thought this is so exactly on target for what I think about when I make a photograph. Sloan would tell his students, and I quote now, "The well-articulated design has the same unity, design, proportion, and dynamic structural excitement as a fine bridge." I guess what I'm trying to say is that for me, putting together a photograph involves the same kinds of thought and calculation and considerations as an engineer might think about when putting together, when designing a bridge. The other thing that's really important in my pictures, which makes it hard to see when they're projected or on the internet ever, is that I rely on people discovering small details. So at first glance, you can see that what you're looking at, I think you can see, is the tablet of the 10 Commandments in Bridgeport, right across from Wheeling Island on the Ohio side. But that's not all that's going on. And all those other little things kind of conspire together to complicate the picture's meaning. So you've got, this military figure, presumably it's a World War I commemorative statue. And then across the way, it says Martial Arts Training Center. So there's kind of a little verbal, visual kind of play going on there. And then the shield, which suggests, again, something military. And then you've got the 10 Commandments, and in the corner, you've got the word unbelievable as a kind of sarcastic comment. I mean, none of these things add up to a literal story, but they complicate the way you think about what you're looking at. And I try to make pictures that carry those complications. Sometimes I'm also just interested in making pictures that are, make you smile as a way of sort of eliciting sympathy for the people that live in these places. And here again, it's not just a picture of someone's underwear. What I really was interested in was the way that the underwear is hung in a kind of peak that mimics the peaks of the shed roof and the porch roofs and the house roofs in the background. It's like they did it so that they matched, so that their laundry would fit with the landscape. We've switched to color here. In 2010, I started using a digital camera. Actually, I'd started the previous year, but still learning how to use it in 2010. After using the same film camera for over 27 years, I suddenly started doing something that technically was radically different. The most obvious difference, of course, to an audience is going to be that these photographs are in color. I've always been interested in making photographs that look real. I'm not interested in making photographs that remind you of old pictures or a camera look or anything like that. I'm interested in photographs that look like the world, that when you look at them, you think, yes, I believe that's what it looked like. Obviously, working in black and white, we don't see in black and white. But if you go back to the 70s when I began making pictures, people were used to looking at things in black and white. And color was really very problematical. You couldn't control it. If you think about what Kodak colors looked like when we were young, or what National Geographic pictures looked like, that's not what the world looks like. That's what color film used to look like in those days. It wasn't until the 21st century that with the development of digital photography and something called color management, that it became possible to make color photographs that were accurate to how things really look. So I was trying to learn how to use this new camera, learning how to see with this new camera, and I figured the smart thing to do would be to go to a place that's familiar, that I knew well, so that I could sort of shake off the cobwebs and figure out what I'm doing. And I came back to Wheeling, and I kept coming back to Wheeling, the place that had banned me, over and over again, looking, with no particular objective in mind, except that I continued to find that Wheeling to be a very, very interesting place. Interesting architecturally, interesting sociologically, interesting what it tells you about the people. I mean, if you look at this, this is kind of your one-stop entertainment row, right? You've got your adult video next to the bar, next to the sportsman's club. I guess it's a one-stop entertainment for guys more than women. And then on the right edge, a sober reminder of everyday reality when you go back to work, the Wheeling Office Supply Company. So I didn't set out to make a book. What happened was a friend of mine in Europe put me in touch with a publisher who wanted to do a book. And I didn't want to give him any of the projects that I'd been working on as books because I wanted those to be published and distributed in the US. And I just started looking through my pictures, and I found that I had easily 100 photographs that I liked from Wheeling that I thought were pretty interesting. And so then it was just a matter of figuring out which ones to use, what sequence to put them in, were there things missing that I needed to attend to, and so I didn't sequence the book geographically, I didn't sequence it chronologically. I basically structured it according to the different ways that people use different parts of the landscape. So I started out with photographs of businesses and places of commerce, mostly downtown. This, of course, is the Cooley-Benz furniture store in South Wheeling. I'm told that the building on the left is actually the original Cooley-Benz building before they built the one across the street, but I haven't been able to verify that. And just looking at the kinds of ordinary everyday businesses that make up the fabric of a small city like this, things where people go and use. At the same time, I'm very interested in what happens when you look really closely. So this is a hand-painted sign. They might at some point have used stencils. Other times you can see that the letters are pretty freehand. And they redo them every few years, and they paint over, and it doesn't quite line up. And so, this is not some commercially printed sign. Someone is out there with a brush every couple of years going over this again to revive it. And some parts they don't bother with. You can barely read the part that says entrance or the part that says one-day service. So it's evidence of someone caring enough about something to do it right. No one paints letters that carefully with the outline and the serifs and that attention to detail anymore. You put something on your printer and go to Kinko's and get a banner printed. So this to me too spoke about the city's past. But I wasn't just interested in the past. I'm not interested in nostalgia. I'm really interested in what's happening to these places now as well and how these things overlap. So photographing both a shoe repair store that's closed down and a store that could not have existed before 1998 because it's called Diagon Alley, which is a reference to the Harry Potter books, the first one of which didn't come to America until 1998. So you have something that's really pretty brand new. For those of you who don't know, I don't know it either, but it bills itself as a metaphysical supply store and a witchcraft store. In the Harry Potter books, Diagon Alley is a witchcraft store. Interestingly, I found this picture I'd made in 1987, before Competti's had moved. I don't even know if they're still in business. I mean, I know that if you look carefully, the assignment says they're about to move. But what I was, I loved all the little details here. Welcome home, Wheeling Pit. Here's a sign saying they're going on vacation. Here are stylized shoes, and then you can see the customer's shoes lined up on the shelves inside, waiting for them to be picked up. And of course, my favorite part, which I guess we can't enlarge, the pun. Have them doctor your shoes, heal them, attend to their dying needs, and save their souls. And they're all misspelled words that mean something else. So they're all jokes based on spelling, which is interesting because it tells you that they're aiming at a literate audience. I can imagine some of the students I've had over the years at the university not getting it because they wouldn't catch the spelling errors. And yet what's even funnier is I just noticed this yesterday. There's still a grammatical error. There shouldn't be an apostrophe at the end of souls. It's just a plural. Anyway, And I moved on to other kinds of quintessential small town businesses, like a barbershop. And again, I'm interested in signs. You don't need to have a sign that says it's a barbershop if you've got a striped pole. Everybody in America knows what that means. But just in case you need some added inducement to go into that minuscule building, they're telling you you're going to look better and feel better. I gather that this place is finally closed too. It seemed that way. I drove by a couple months ago. And the kinds of businesses that made Wheeling what it was. I mean, not just steel mills, but this is the brewery next. You have both a current ongoing business, Kennedy's Hardware, and you've got the what is it called? Schambach's Brewery. Schmobach. Okay, I can never get it right because But anyway, it started off as something, and then he came from Germany and bought it and changed the name to his own name. But anyway, it's this beautiful, amazing architecture. It had tunnels that went into the hillside. Again, it's sort of a critical part of Wheeling's history, but also a building that's still in use. Part of it's used by the part in the middle is used by the hardware store. By this point, of course, we're talking about the 21st century. There was very little left in Wheeling itself to tell you about its past as a steel mill town, other than the big downtown headquarters building. The only thing still standing was the LaBelle Cut Iron Works, which of course was originally its own company, was so central to Wheeling's history that one of the nicknames for Wheeling used to be Nail Town, Nail City. At this point, it was boarded up and abandoned as a bicycle covered with vines in the foreground. And of course, as you probably all know, it's now been entirely demolished and they've put up a housing development. One business that hasn't been torn down, that has endured for a long, long time, is the Block Brothers Tobacco Factory, where they invented ribbon cut tobacco, where they still make nail pouch tobacco. But I was really interested in that blue Victorian Queen Anne house and the way that, if you know the neighborhood of South Wheeling where Block Brothers is, they've taken over a lot. They've sprawled over everything, put up other buildings. Some holdout with a sort of tough pioneer spirit is refusing to move. He's got his beautiful Victorian house and he's put up a stockade fence around it and a sign that says "Beware of the dog," which you might not be able to read. Yes, you can. And he's hanging in there no matter what, even though if you look on the left side of the picture, there's sort of the imminent possibility of demolition as that bucket truck excavator creeps closer. So again, it's the idea of a landscape, of things in the landscape, places that have been there a long time, that are tied to the history of the place, and yet that's undergoing ongoing change, ongoing evolution. Here again is another one of those old buildings that, like the Victorian house, must have been there before Block Brothers was built, based on the architecture. Although it's interesting because it must have been built as a rental since it's a duplex, and people didn't usually build duplexes, even in factory towns, unless they were for factory workers. One of the things about working in color is you start to think about the meaning of color, or what reactions people have to different kinds of colors. And just there's something to me about the juxtaposition of that amazing turquoise and the word aromatics, even though obviously the turquoise is not the aromatics building. It seems somehow you could almost smell that color because it's so vivid, it's so pungent. I think I've probably walked down every alley in the downtown part of Wheeling anyway, maybe not in all the hills around it, not in the suburbs. I don't drive. I get somewhere, I park, and I get out and walk around because the kinds of things I'm looking for, the kinds of things that seem to me interesting, significant, that tell the story, you have to be moving slowly enough to see them. I'm sure if I'd driven down this alley and watching the road, not trying to hit anybody, I wouldn't have seen, for example, that house that's in the background on the right that was built with the understanding that there'd be another house on the other side, so they would share a firewall. So it's, the right slope of the sloping roof. And obviously the other house was never built because at some point the owners decided to rent out the space for an advertisement. And then at some later point yet, someone else came along and did build a house covering half the advertisement, but with no regard for the original architecture. So you have this one little house butted up against the firewall of that grand three chimneyed house. I've tried to figure out what "for the blood" means. I can only assume it must have been some medicine, some tonic that they were advertising that was good for your blood, but I haven't been able to find any reference. The thing about walking down alleys is you get a view into people's private lives, looking into backyards. You see how people really live. People tend to keep the facades of their houses, the fronts that face the street, the public sides, kind of take care of them. They're more publicly presentable. But when you look in people's backyards, you see how people are, how daily life is going on. And so here's this little set of garden furniture someone's using their backyard, even though they're directly behind the shipping warehouse of the tobacco factory. And again, I'm taking you through the sequence of the book. So as we, beyond the sort of the big industries, I also photographed quite a bit in that neighborhood that's fast disappearing, where Wheeling Creek enters the Ohio River. The mouth of Wheeling Creek used to be all sorts of warehouses, all sorts of factories there. In fact, again, I'm going to quote the AAA guide. They said, in that neighborhood, one could find companies manufacturing stogies, china, mattresses, glassware, matches, sausages, macaroni, textiles, and paper boxes. All this in a few blocks at the mouth of Wheeling Creek. And of course, windows. Here's a window factory that apparently hasn't seen fit to supply their next door neighbors. I also was really interested in the fact that it's Water Street. It's not called Water Street anymore. It's now called Lane A, very poetic. But I wondered whether this sort of blue, swimming pool blue paint that they use on the bottom was a reference to the possibility that they could flood, as used to happen. I mean, as happened as recently as 1997, in fact. I drove by there today, it's gone. It's just an empty lot. Other kinds of businesses, I actually don't know what this business is, but I love the way they had this bizarre artificial color that's not found in nature anywhere, but it is pretty much the color of Wheeling street signs. So there's a kind of correspondence there. I'm actually in Benwood, West Virginia at this point. This is the southern limit of the town, of the city of Wheeling. So I'm standing in Benwood, we're looking north towards Wheeling. And I was just interested in that neat little garden with its little plantings squeezed between the edge of the building and the sidewalk, and what real plants look like versus someone's idea of an artificial plant. Then I also photographed places where people go in their leisure time, both ones that are no longer there and existing ones. This was PC's Irish Club and Bar on Wheeling Island. And again, color adds a layer of information, which might not be obvious. But I remember when this building, when the green of the awning and the green of the wall was Kelly green. It was Irish green. And with time, it's faded and it's become blue. And so there's this kind of odd disappearance of this quintessential Irish symbol that's kind of faded away. So I pay a lot of attention to signs and what they can tell us about a place. For example, here you see the furniture store sign, Cooley Benz, in the background, which clearly must have been made at the time that the store was built in the early 20th century because of the typeface, because of the kinds of lettering. But then you look at Southside Hardware, also not there anymore, and it's obviously not an old sign because it has a modern key. But at the same time, they're trying to fit in, so they've used a kind of typeface, kinds of letters that look like an early 20th century sign. But my favorite part of this is that wonderful Art Deco martini glass, so that bisected olive. I'm guessing it's from the 1960s. I only hope somebody saved it. That also has been torn down. I hope one of you got the sign, because they don't make them like that anymore. I mentioned that I use the WPA guides. I try to do a lot of research about the places I photograph. Most of you are going to recognize that this is the building that was Marsh Wheeling that made stogies, that I guess recently has been bought, and there's some hope that it will be restored and renovated. I was interested in, again, the layering, where you can see what was there before, how at one point where the sign in the background says Marsh Stogies, and you can see that there was a roof there at some point. So after the sign went up, they built something, then it came down and the sign's revealed again. Again, just the sort of layerings of time. I'm sure you all know the story of Marsh Stogies, when Marsh would sell his cigars on the National Road to travelers in Conestoga wagons, and they would take them with them as part of along with their westward migration, which is how they became popular all over the country. They were called Conestoga cigars, and then that was shortened to stogies. But none of that's in the picture. What's important to me is understanding these things, because it informs my decision about whether to make the picture or not, and what to show you in the picture or And finally, the book closes, or actually it's a good half of the book, with where people live. You know, the neighborhoods where people live near the factories. You know, these older houses that, you know, you can tell their age by the fact that they don't have front porches. Their stoops open directly onto the street, as was the case in the beginning, in the early 19th century, late 18th century. But also the sense of time passing. You've got a bar that's clearly a contemporary modern bar. It's called Rascals. You've got the footprint, the imprint of where a building used to stand. And you have this idea that somebody cares. Somebody is going to the trouble of repainting the shingles on that red house. They're not finished. They've got most of the facade done. They're moving along. There's this sense of keeping things up, taking care of things, of progress. Sometimes, of course, the photographs show you the opposite, things that are used to be there and are no longer there. This communal building, I don't know if it was 4 apartments, but I think it must have been eventually become 4 apartments, because each of those 4 fireplaces is decorated differently. You've got wallpaper, you've got paint, you've got tile around them. So it's kind of like a cross section into a series of lives. But I'm not interested specifically in ruins for their own sake. I'm really interested in the position they occupy through time in the modern world. So here, for example, this is up on Wood Street. You know, you've got this beautiful hand-carved woodwork on top, above the windows, above the door. But then you also have signs that people are really trying to improve things and renovate. The stone facing that's been put over this house, the awning, the fact that the doors are new, and yet, whatever, you know, they're fighting a losing battle in the sense that both these houses look like they're about to collapse. They're listing pretty significantly. Or here again, this is the last standing house of what used to be a row of houses, and you can see where they, you know, bought plastic siding to kind of seal off the gap between what were originally 2 buildings. I don't even know if this place is still standing, sadly. It's funny, every book I've ever done, I've included a picture of my car in it. It's not always intentionally, but somehow there's always one that creeps it in. So that little blue car is my wife's car. My car wasn't able to drive to Wheeling and back in the day in those days, but that's Andrea's. I think a lot of what these pictures are about, I'm watching the clock, are the things people do to make the best of things. That they may be living in an old neighborhood in a town where most of the jobs have gone away, where life is difficult, but they don't give up. And you see the evidence of their not giving up. So these people that are living next to a house that's obviously condemned, you know, they have their little garden there. It's not even really a garden, it's flower pots, but they've gone to the trouble to choose a flower pot whose color matches their shutters and the paint color of their awning. And they've chosen chairs that are the same kind of pale pink of their siding. There's an attempt, it's like the underwear that's hung in a triangle. You know, it's an attempt to make the best of things under less than ideal circumstances. I'm trying to end, so we have 15 minutes left. So my goal was never to do a systematic, you know, description of Wheeling. I wanted to capture the feeling of Wheeling. So I didn't get every neighborhood. I'm sure every one of you is saying to him or herself, why didn't he photograph this or that? There were a couple of things that I did go out and photograph for the book, 2. One was that picture I showed you at the beginning where all those tall buildings with the bars and the adult video and stuff. I'd always been interested in that block and never made a picture I liked. So that was made after the book was conceived. And I took a picture of the old stable at what used to be the racetrack. But it was just so jarring in the book that the editor said that just doesn't fit. Otherwise, it was really just a matter of what pictures give you a sense of this old place and how it's structured and what life might be like to live here. And part of it, I think, was just, I think the pictures are about a certain kind of hope, and hope that's revealed through beauty in unexpected circumstances. The beauty of that light coming through in the golden, you know, golden light on the hills in the background. This is winter. I always think it's funny when people ask me to talk about my pictures. I'm not a writer. I want you to look at the pictures. If I wanted to talk, I'd write. So, you know, I want you to look at what you're seeing here. Look at that beautiful cobblestone alley and how it's all wavy. It would have been laid flat at some point, but over time, as the ground has frozen and thawed and shifted. Or look at Mr. Security Dog giving us the hairy eyeball. Or look at the way that the security dog's siding is almost the same color as the neighbor's chimney, which creates, again, a kind of sort of sense of harmony, sense of beauty. I think in the end, for me, what interests me about these pictures in this place is the way that one finds beauty in unexpected contexts. I mean, you know, this is an ordinary scene down an alley in South Wheeling. And yet to me, you know, the quality of the light, the quality of the colors, the sense of the space, you know, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. You know, to me, I think that's the essence of what these pictures are about. And so the book ends on what I think is an optimistic note. You've got that beautifully, you know, very carefully decorated little brick house with its bright yellow trim and its red awnings. And it's kind of nice that the Intelligencer uses that green because it kind of works well with those two other colors. But in the background, you can see that someone is restoring that house. It's probably not a new house based on the way the chimney looks, but they're putting up new siding, they've got new windows and doors put in. There's a sense of hope for the future. And yet, at the same time, you're still reminded of Wheeling's industrial past. You can see the fragment of chew mail pouch tobacco sign on the facade in the background. And so we come around to, you know, Wheeling as a place where tobacco has been made for a long, long time. I don't know, a long time ago, 20, 30 years ago, maybe 20, someone was interviewing me and they asked me, what's your favorite place to photograph? And I could not provide an answer because to me, what I love about photography is the exploration and the discovery. And so my favorite place has to be the one I haven't found yet. It's a moving target. But as I was doing this book, I realized, you know, I've been photographing in Wheeling, West Virginia for 35 years. And unbeknownst to me, maybe it did become my favorite place to photograph because as I drove around today, I realized I need to come back here. There's more pictures to be made. Anyway, thank you. I'm happy to answer questions if you have them. I tried to keep the schedule. Yes.
Many of the pictures that you have shown make me sad. I hope that when you drive around now, that you'll find some pictures that would make you happy if I saw. And I know you do see some, you know, some positive things in some of these issues, but I don't know, I guess as someone who lives here, those are the parts of Wheeling that I do not want other people to see and think that that's me.
Well, you know, this comes up a lot, not just with regard to Wheeling. One of the things that I sort of worry about is when cities or towns try to sort of make something new of themselves and they ignore the past completely. And you know, I mean, the classical example of that is, say, Colonial Williamsburg, which looks really nothing like what it originally looked like. It's been reinvented for tourism. But all over the Midwest, all over the West, you see downtowns that are trying to reinvent themselves. And they do so by overlooking the past, by embracing what's new, or reinventing the past and turning it into a kind of caricature of itself. And you know, what I love about Wheeling is it's not like that. The past is present everywhere. And yes, obviously, like anywhere, you know, there are places where people are poorer, there are neighborhoods where life is more difficult, and there are things, you know, not everything is brand new and perfectly kept up. But at the same time, it has those layers of patina, of information, of meaning that tie it to the past in ways that very few cities do. So I don't think, to me, these photographs aren't sad. I mean, to me, they're I hope they're beautiful. I guess I shouldn't be the judge of that myself, but I certainly don't see them as sad. That's not really an answer, is it? but you know, honestly, I'm not sure there is an answer. I mean, you know, I will photograph whatever seems meaningful and beautiful. It's visually striking and whatever that's out there. Yes.
I jogged for 20 minutes and walked the last 20, and I do what you do. Only it's not my living or anything, but when you walk, you do see things that people don't see. And the first time I walked on here, because I live up the river, when I went across the suspension bridge, I stopped and put my hands on the stone, and the work that went into that. And I mean, it's, you feel things, and beauty is what is in them.
Well, I guess
You know what I
I should have let you answer the question. Yeah, I mean, I think,
Beauty
I
is-
agree, I agree.
And I see things that just, I tell people, get out of your car bigger picture.
Right,
You know?
absolutely.
In your book, do you have an interpretation of your pictures? Because I'm looking at things that I would never have noticed had you not pointed them out.
No, I don't. You know, there's sort of different ways of making a book of photographs. I mean, some people really want text. I remember once giving a book of mine to the dean of the college where I taught. He told me a few weeks later he hadn't read it yet, which, you know, it had an introduction, but that wasn't the important part. But that was, as a literary man, that was what he was going to concentrate on. So there are books where there's a lot of written information. The designer, the publisher for this book, really took a much more purist approach, and I had to fight him a little bit. So there are no page numbers, there are no captions. They're just photographs. The fight that I won is I did get to write an introduction where I talk about my discovery in wheeling and the history of wheeling and what's happened in wheeling and what kind of place it is. And so that provides a kind of context that, you know, if you read it before you look at the pictures, just how it's sequenced, that provides a kind of context for understanding what you're looking at. But no, you know, I hope that anybody who's going to buy a photo book is going to take the time to look closely at the pictures, and some of the things that I'm pointing out, they'll eventually see. Otherwise, they've wasted their money. So, you know.
I'm just thinking of your Campetti sign with the apostrophe S. How many times I walked past that and never paid attention?
It took me 30 years to notice the apostrophe. Right? I mean, I photographed it first in '87. I didn't think of it till this week as I was going through these pictures. Yeah, I mean, you just have to look. Yes?
Just another comment, you may not be aware, but South Wheeling has recently been listed on the National Register of Historic Places.
That's great. I did not know that. I know a lot of houses there are, but that's really good news.
So other people have recognized the value, even though they were more blue-collar homes.
Right, totally, yeah.
Not the high Victorian and those ones in the city.
No, it was definitely factory neighborhoods. I mean, but that's really good. I'm very happy to hear that. Yeah, that's, you know, because I get depressed every time I see another building that's gone. So there's something good. Yes.
Mr. Campetti just retired about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So we don't retire anybody that's repairing shoes anymore.
Wow. Yeah, it's.
When his dad first started, I think they had about 7 shoe couples.
Wow. So where did they move to? I mean, obviously that's been
He was
closed.
on Market Street. He had a nice big storefront.
Right across from the Victoria Theater.
Oh, okay. I just never noticed it. Yeah. So really, he just moved a couple blocks away.
Yeah.
Out of that alley.
Right. Which has an interesting name. It's
It's
called
called Stones Alley.
No, it's called Bridge Alley.
Well, you call it Stones Alley because Stone Thomas department store was here.
Okay.
And it was a shortcut to get from Market Street to Main Street.
Right.
There used to be, before Campetti, or maybe even before Campetti in that little alley, there used to be a little restaurant run by 2 little old Southern ladies that had tea and cookies and baked goods in there. It was kind of really out and fast.
Somewhere around there, I remember a Chinese restaurant that had really elaborate architecture, but I couldn't figure out what it was.
Well, that.
It's again in those alleys.
Wall Street. Corcoran used to be in there too.
Okay.
The bank, maybe one time, and Corcoran was in there selling religious.
Yeah, it probably had the bank
And
originally.
then it became the Chinese place.
Yeah.
They painted the outer pillars
Right.
in Chinese red
And gold, yeah.
gold.
Yeah.
That's just down the street from the McClure Hotel.
Okay, yeah. Sometimes it takes me a while to remember where things were going back 30 years. Are there any other questions? Yes.
It's not a question, but you were talking about South Wheeling before. You may not be aware that South Wheeling has an organization that's been promoting it for a long time.
I wasn't aware of that, but I'm glad to hear it.
The meeting in a church down there. They were meeting in a church.
Do you have pictures of Coleman's fish? We're noted for that.
That's the one that's across the street from the market, from the, yeah.
Part of the market.
Yeah, but it's not in the center. Is it in the center shed? I don't remember. It is, okay. I've been there. No, I don't have pictures of it. No, I mean, like I said, I wasn't deliberately trying to be comprehensive, because if you try to do that, you're always, someone's always going to be upset. In the early part of the 20th century, there was this company called the Chicago Gravure Company that would do like multi-volume books on cities. I don't know if they did one for Wheeling or not. They did one for Akron. It's like 9 volumes. And it supposedly shows every important building and every important home. And inevitably, wherever they did them, there would be people who'd be furious because their home was not in there. You either do every building or you don't even pretend to be comprehensive. So there's a lot I missed. That's why I'm saying I could keep on photographing here for years. Yeah.
I noticed when you were showing the beginning, all black and white. I made a notation, you were black and white. I used to always believe that when Life magazine was black and white, you got more detail when you saw the pictures than when they began using color a lot in Life magazine. I thought it kind of went downhill when they started using color. Black and white was phased out.
My feeling is it's probably not a function of color, but a function of having different photographers later on. I mean, when Life was started, Henry Luce hired the best photographers in the country, Margaret Burke White, and all, people who were really the most well-known, most accomplished photographers in the U.S. And with time, especially after World War II, not really after the 60s, things changed, budgets became smaller. You couldn't spend 6 months on an assignment the way that, say, there's a man called W. Eugene Smith who photographed a lot for Life magazine, did an essay about Albert Schweitzer. He did a photo essay on a nurse midwife in the South. I mean, he was sort of the quintessential Life magazine photographer, and he would literally spend 6 months on an assignment. National Geographic now, you're lucky if they'll give you 2 weeks. So it's a different time. I mean, the more time you put in, the better the pictures are going to be.
I do agree with you about the color in the old books of the National Geographic. It's so artificial.
Yeah, I mean, that was just an inevitable offshoot of the process. There was no way around that. Some people like that. I mean, nowadays you can buy filters and programs in your computer that will make things look like those old colors. Anyway. Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank you very much for coming here.